Hello everyone. As a way of introduction of myself, I was religious in my childhood, and then in my youth, as most of us have our own ideas, I became agnostic. I was religious, of course, because my parents had trained me that way earlier in childhood. And then I happened to come to Brown University as a graduate student. There I got good exposure, I would say, about science and technology and engineering in general. And also I happened to come to Vedanta Society during that time, which also gave me some good meaning about what religion is. So with that background, I hope I will do some justice to the topic in this presentation. The title suggests that Vedanta is some sort of an arbiter for conflict between science and religion, or at least it conveys an idea that it will be unbiased enough to look at this conflict without any prejudice. If so, one would expect Vedanta to be unrelated to science and religion, but is that the case? Actually, it is just the opposite. If I may define science as quest for truth and religion as quest for God, then I would say Vedanta is in fact both science and religion. Of course, any religion would have truth as its bedrock, but Vedanta goes a step further than any conventional religion to use truth and God interchangeably. So having included the goals of science and religion, Vedanta is well suited to study the arguments that these two fields raise against each other, as it actively advocates the norms and practices of both these fields for its own practitioners. We will dwell on this subject of Vedanta as both science and religion at the end of this talk. I will borrow a lot of content from Swami Vivekananda's lectures in presenting this theme. This debate of science versus religion is usually not only found to be happening in a formal symposium, but also in discussions within our family or friends or colleagues in office or on discussion forums in the internet. Before we delve into this conflict itself, we must explore what the scope of this conflict was in the past. This conflict between science and religion was non-existent in many Eastern religions that originated in India and elsewhere. It was not known in Islam or Judaism either, presumably. I'm not very sure about that, but I would guess. And perhaps many traditions in Africa. However, we must also say that most of these religious groups did not witness the tremendous scientific development seen in countries that are predominantly Christian, say Europe. So chances of a conflict arising between science and religion in these regions are minimal, as religion itself never faced a strong opponent. Even in Christianity, it was only in the medieval times that an institutionalized opposition to science arose, and that too only when science concluded something that was against the then established religious doctrine. The antagonism from science is usually towards a specific conception of God, namely the anthropomorphic one, which is the most prevalent one in religion worldwide. Also, opposition from religion towards science is not in its entirety, but only specific conclusions that science puts forward that are contrary to a religious doctrine or its interpretation by a religious authority. Lastly, generally speaking, it is not that all scientists have a conflict with religion. So what we find is a very large geographical populace over a very large period of time had no conflict whatsoever between the two fields. Then probably we may wonder, are we making a mountain of a molehill then? In the present times, I would say there are enough skeptics of religion across all countries, born amongst different religious groups, that this conflict can no longer be dismissed of insignificance. And to a much lesser extent, there are skeptics of science amongst religious groups too, not due to any doubt of the veracity of conclusions of science, but mainly because those conclusions hurt their religious sentiments. Swami Vivekananda says the following on this debate. Religions have many times looked down, unfortunately, on all secular knowledge. And not only so, but many times have refused to be justified by the aid of secular knowledge. In consequence, all the world over, there have been fights between secular knowledge and religious knowledge, the one claiming infallible authority as its guide, refusing to listen to anything that secular knowledge has to say on that point, The other, with its shining instrument of reason, wanting to cut to pieces everything religion could bring forward. This fight has been and is still waged in every country. Religions have been again and again defeated and almost exterminated. The foundations have been all undermined, and the modern man, whatever he may say in public, knows in the privacy of his heart that he can no more believe. Believing certain things because an organized body of priests tell him to believe, believing because it is written in certain books, believing because his people like him to believe, the modern man knows to be impossible for him. There are, of course, a number of people who seem to acquiesce in the so-called popular faith, but we also know for certain that they do not think. Their idea of belief may be better translated as non-thinking carelessness. This fight cannot last much longer without breaking to pieces all the buildings of religion. End of quote. In the past, opposition to either religion or science was largely confined to only some of the serious practitioners of either field, whereas these days a large number of non-serious practitioners of either field take up one of these fields as their prop to fight the other one. That is why you have atheists, who may not themselves be anywhere remotely close to science, criticizing religion in support of science. The same goes for religion too. Many people stand by religion when in conflict with science, not because they are serious about what religion asks them to do with their lives, but simply because they cherish some traditional ideals that it propagates, and they have grown comfortable around them. This debate sometimes also morphs into reason versus faith debate. Even within the practice of a religion, it could be presented as an argument between intellectual thoughts and the emotional feelings. So this debate happens in different forms at various levels. Henceforth, whenever I use the word scientist in this talk, I mean it to be one who is a votary of science, that includes not only the actual scientist, but also those who advocate its methods and attitudes like rationalists, using reasoning, etc. Similarly, when I use the word religionist, it implies serious practitioners of religion, believers in a religious doctrine, along with all others who stand by what a religion preaches, but may not be in any way connected to a religious practice. We will look into 5 arguments that are presented by scientists and religionists against each other. The first one is veracity. Acceptance of any hypothesis in science as a fact has a well-defined procedure. In any domain of science, say physics, there exist 2 branches, theoretical and experimental. The theoretical branch is analytical studies using the existing laws or through a new hypothesis to explain some observed natural phenomena or laboratory experiments. The experimental branch involves validation of hypotheses put forward by theoretical branch or reporting observations that engenders a new hypothesis in future. Therefore, both these branches feed and support each other. The epistemology or methodologies of science is threefold. First one is a demonstrability. A truth must be able to be demonstrated either through analytical or experimental studies using established laws. The second one is verifiability. The truth established by a person at a specific place and time should be able to be reproduced at any other place and time by anyone else. And lastly, falsifiability. An inherent possibility of refutability of a statement, hypothesis, or theory must exist. Falsifiability's dominance over verifiability stems from the fact that any number of positive experimental outcomes can never absolutely confirm a scientific theory. But a single example that counters the theory will be decisive in falsifying it. For example, you may conduct thousands of experiments to prove gravity, but that doesn't imply that gravity is universal and exists always. At best, it could be said it was existing at the place and time where you were conducting the experiment. So scientists, instead of venturing upon the impossible task of providing absolute proof, consider theory to be tentatively true if ample opportunities were proposed to disprove it, but no one was able to do so. The longer such a theory retains this provisional status and more attempts were made to test it, the greater is its claim to be true. Science, being empirical, allows inductive reasoning to generalize a set of observations into a law, and then uses the infallible deductive reasoning using this law to explain other phenomena, thereby strengthening the law arrived at through the fallible inductive reasoning. So let's move on to religion now. Does religion have such a well-defined validation procedures for the truth it preaches? Naively, such rigorous validation procedures are considered to be absent in religion by scientists. But more unfortunately, even the religions themselves claim there is no need for such procedures. We should first understand the domain of application of any field to come up with a suitable validation procedure. The domain of application of science is the physical world that is observable to the five senses. Physical sciences zealously like to confine themselves to that domain. Hence, any theory that does not have an experimental backup is not fully accepted by the scientific community at large, however intellectually appealing and complete it may appear to our reasoning faculty. Religion, on the other hand, has its domain of application as mental and spiritual realms. This clear demarcation is usually missed by scientists and religionists. Hence, we have situations where a Galileo is persecuted by religionists or a scientist dismissing all religious truths as figments of imagination. But those who have reached the pinnacle in either science or religion recognize these domains clearly, unlike the multitudes of half-baked scientists or religionists of undeveloped minds who want to be stubbornly ignorant. To quote Albert Einstein, "How does it happen that a properly endowed natural scientist comes to concern himself with epistemology? Is there not some more valuable work to be done in his specialty?" That's what I hear many of my colleagues ask, and I sense it from many more. But I cannot share this sentiment. When I think about the ablest students whom I have encountered in my teaching, that is, those who distinguish themselves by their independence of judgment and not just their quick-wittedness, I can affirm that they had a vigorous interest in epistemology. They happily began discussions about the goals and methods of science, and they showed unequivocally, through tenacious defense of their views, that the subject seemed important to them. End of quote. To quote Richard Feynman, he ridiculed the scientists with undeveloped minds who are not only ignorant but refuse to even acknowledge it. Quote, "There were a lot of fools at the conference, pompous fools, and pompous fools drive me up the wall. Ordinary fools are all right. You can talk to them and try to help them out. But pompous fools, guys who are fools and covering it all over and impressing people as to how wonderful they are with all this hocus pocus, that I cannot stand. An ordinary fool isn't a faker. An honest fool is all right. But a dishonest fool is terrible." It sounds a bit humorous, but I think, of course, many of us agree with that. This view is very valid in religion. Even in religion, we find similar ideas. Coming back to Swami Vivekananda on this topic of applicability of domain for each field, he says, "If we push inquiry far enough in the world of perception, we must reach a plane beyond perception. Reason is really stored up and classified perception, preserved by memory. We can never imagine or reason beyond our sense perceptions. Nothing beyond reason can be an object of sense knowledge. We feel the limited character of reason, yet it does bring us to the plane where we get a glimpse of something beyond. Religion is the science which learns the transcendental in nature through the transcendental in man. Only for the infinitesimal portion of the universe which comes into sense perception are we able to find a reason. Never can we give the reason for any fundamental principle. When we meet a new fact, we at once strive to put it in some existing category, and the attempt to do this is to reason. When we succeed in placing the fact, it gives a certain amount of satisfaction. But we can never go beyond the physical plane in this classification. That man can transcend the limits of the senses is the emphatic testimony of all the past ages. The Upanishads told 5,000 years ago that the realization of God could never be had through the senses. So far, modern agnosticism agrees, but the Vedas go further than the negative side and assert in the plainest terms that man can and does transcend this sense-bound, frozen universe. He can, as it were, find a hole in the ice through which he can pass and reach the whole ocean of life. Only by so transcending the world of sense can he reach his true self and realize what he really is. End of quote. So going back to the epistemological principles that we saw in science, can we see a demonstrability in religion? Since religion deals with mental and spiritual realms, the demonstration of religious truths cannot be made through the senses. However, this lack of demonstrability through the sense perceptions doesn't render religion to be false. Many of our thoughts and feelings cannot be demonstrated through senses to others, but that doesn't mean they are false. And moving on to the verification, even if this distinction in applicability of domains between the science and religion is borne in mind, many scientific people naively bring the verification procedures applicable to the physical realm into religion, only to find that those procedures cannot prove the truths of religion. And then unscientifically they conclude that religion itself is false. On this note, Swami Vivekananda says, in the first place, every science must have its own method of investigation. If you want to become an astronomer and sit down and cry, astronomy, astronomy, it will never come to you. The same with chemistry. A certain method must be followed. You must go to a laboratory, take different substances, mix them up, compound them, experiment with them, and out of that will come a knowledge of chemistry. I could preach you thousands of sermons, but they would not make you religious until you practice the method. These are the truths of the sages of all countries, of all ages, of men pure and unselfish, who had no motive but to do good to the world. They all declare that they have found some truth higher than what the senses can bring to us, and they invite verification. They ask us to take up the method and practice honestly, and then, if we do not find this higher truth, we will have the right to say there is no truth in the claim. But before we have done that, we are not rational in denying the truth of their assertions. So we must work faithfully using the prescribed methods, and light will come. End of quote. So a proper technique has to be adopted to realize God in religion, and this technique is usually called the spiritual practice. The lack of demonstration capability in religion makes this verification procedure of spiritual practice a very personal endeavor, unlike in sciences. The individual must conduct the religious verification experiment himself or herself. And this verification procedure in religion, like in science, demands preparation on the part of the experimenter. Everyone knows that to understand intricacies of science, one has to undergo training for many years. Only such mental preparation will enlighten the truth that science has to offer. But when it comes to religious truths, somehow everyone, including the scientists, think that whatever pet idea one's own mind has is the truth. And no personal development or effort is necessary to train oneself to perceive the actual truth established in religion. If a Buddha, a Ramakrishna, or a Ramana Maharshi had to put so much effort to train oneself in order to perceive the religious truth, why does every Henry or Harry think that religious truth can just be simply perceived or analyzed with one's own undeveloped mind without any effort? Swami Vivekananda says in this regard, taking chemistry and physics, with which we are so familiar and of which we have read so much, is it true that everyone in this world is able to understand the demonstration even of the commonest subjects? Take any boor and show him one of your experiments. What will he understand of it? Nothing. It requires a good deal of previous training to be brought up to the point of understanding an experiment. Before that, he cannot understand it at all. So, on the face of it, it is absurd if this be the meaning of scientific demonstration, the bringing down of intricate facts to the plane on which we are now. So I have to say is that in order to have scientific explanation of physical phenomena, we require not only perfect evidence on the side of the phenomena themselves, but a good deal of training on the part of those who want to see. End of quote. Moving to the third principle, the falsifiability in religion. I think I moved one slide faster. Can religion provide any criterion by which there is a possibility of falsifying it? For example, if we say God exists, now how will I falsify this statement? What evidence need to be given to prove that God does not exist? The difficulty is actually logical and holds true for any positive statement because a negative statement cannot be proved. How would you falsify that Yeti or the Loch Ness Monster exists? By trying to prove that Yeti or Loch Ness Monster doesn't exist. What evidence would you give to prove their non-existence? It is true that many religious doctrines are not falsifiable, again, because we stick to the realm of senses. Another simple example, like say I am peaceful. How can we falsify this statement? We cannot really falsify the inner feelings and emotions and thoughts. Does our inability to falsify a statement render it to be false? Not falsifiable doesn't mean it is untrue, although it may be called unscientific by scientists. We have seen that amongst the three epistemological principles held by science, only the verification holds well for religion, as it can be applied to the non-sensuous realm. The empirical epistemology or methodology in science, with its reliance entirely on sense perceptions, should also be questioned. How do you validate or corroborate this methodology of reliance on sense perceptions? Sense perceptions cannot validate themselves. Here we face the difficulty mentioned in Kurt Gödel's second incompleteness theorem. No consistent system can be used to prove its own consistency. No proof can be proof of itself. Therefore, we need another paradigm that would be a superset of this paradigm of sense perceptions, and which can validate the axioms or methodology of knowledge obtained through sense perceptions. And religion precisely lays claim to having that superior paradigm. The major contention from science on the spiritual practice to realize the goal of religion is the usage or worship of anthropomorphic forms, which could be a symbol like the Father in the heaven, Vishnu, etc., or some person who had shown exceptional superhuman qualities like Jesus, Ramakrishna, etc. Since religion is about handling the reality presented at one's psychological level, any method that works for the practitioner is true for that person, while it may be false for another. There is no absolute sense of truth or false as far as the religious practice is concerned, given that a certain religious practice leads a particular individual with a given state of mind to reach the religious goal. For most of the people who have very strong awareness of oneself as one's own body, such anthropomorphic images are necessary, as they subconsciously imbibe the image's qualities requisite for attaining the religious goal. I dare say that such people are actually better off than those agnostics or atheists who dismiss such images and do nothing for their own self-improvement. In science too, we see this reverence for some established scientists resembling worship of personages seen in religion. And this reverence sometimes makes a scientist blindly follow another reputed scientist with no verification of what this reputed scientist proposes. For example, Isaac Newton's particle theory of light was more widely accepted than the wave theory of light proposed by Christian Huygens for many years in 17th century, only because Newton was considered the grand master of science then due to his prior successful achievement in proposing the theory of gravity. Hence, we have more mature response from Albert Einstein. Unthinking respect for authority is the greatest enemy of truth. Concepts that have proven useful in ordering things easily achieve such authority over us that we forget their earthly origins and accept them as unalterable givens. And Richard Feynman also quotes in similar vein, science is the belief in the ignorance of the experts. These views, in fact, hold well for religion too. As a parallel to inductive reasoning in science, religion has something similar. The prayers or practices done by saints and other luminaries out of spontaneity of feelings in their heart become the religious prayers or rituals for the masses to follow. The assumption here is, as in inductive reasoning, that since it worked for one person, it would work for all. There is a slight danger here. Unlike science, which deals with only the physical realm, inductive reasoning is very likely to work there. But in religion, the masses should have their minds tuned to the saint who perceived these prayers and rituals and what was very helpful for him or her. Only then would there be some effect in their own lives. If not, the prayers or rituals with no corresponding feeling or intention become a meaningless exercise, which is one of the main factors in many people not being satisfied with religion. In my opinion, as a practice of mysticism, one should innovatively devise one's own prayers and rituals to supplement the conventional ones. Religion also must not shy away from taking up reasoning and sound scientific validation procedures relevant to its domain of applicability. Swami Vivekananda says, "Is religion to justify itself by the discoveries of reason through which every other science justifies itself? Are the same methods of investigation which we apply to sciences and knowledge outside to be applied to the science of religion? If a religion is destroyed by such investigations, it was then all the time useless, unworthy superstition, and the sooner it goes, the better. I am thoroughly convinced that its destruction would be the best thing that could happen. All that is dross will be taken off, no doubt. But the essential parts of religion will emerge triumphant out of this investigation. Not only will it be made scientific at least as any of the conclusions of physics or chemistry, but also will have greater strength because physics or chemistry has no internal mandate to vouch for its truth, which religion has." End of quote. Moving on to the second argument, the definiteness. In science, the goal and procedure to reach the goal is clearly defined. If I mention, say, some terminologies like DNA or speed, you all know what they mean. However, if I ask you to define God, each one of you would come with your own definition, with some admitting it cannot be defined. So what does that word God mean? Is there a universally accepted definition for this term? Superficially speaking, it appears there is not any, and therefore we have so many religious sects, each with their own interpretation of the word God. A lot of bloodshed had occurred in the past based on this simple difference in how one interprets this word God. Similarly, the path to attain or worship God is found to be different amongst religions and also within a religion. That is why we have so many apparently divergent, different religious rituals and sermons about how to lead one's life. If religion itself cannot come to a definitive conclusion on the goal and procedure to attain it, what right does it have to claim itself to be scientific? Since we look for validation within this realm of five senses in science, it is easier to be precise and definitive there. As religion's domain of application is mostly mental and spiritual realms, it is very difficult to express oneself in clear terms about religious truths. For example, if you feel happy, can you express or quantify how happy you are to another person? What would you consider a unit of happiness if you were to quantify it? You may say eating one particular candy is 1 unit of happiness and go ahead to calibrate other sources of happiness. But then you may not get the same 1 unit of happiness eating that candy all the time. Also, what is 1 unit of happiness to you may not be the same unit of happiness for another person, because in the given example above, another person may not enjoy eating that candy the same way as you did. So we clearly see that all the thoughts or feelings of one person cannot be precisely expressed to another person. But that lack of clarity in the expression of thoughts or feelings does not falsify those thoughts or feelings. In the same way, in spiritual realm, where the goal is to search for the underlying fundamental substance or unity, which is beyond sense perceptions, of which all these thoughts or feelings and physical entities are just manifestations, such a lack of precision in expression is very much understandable and in fact reasonable. This fundamental entity, God, is the substratum of everything, including the reasoning faculty. So how can this reasoning faculty explain that fundamental entity called God? It is like saying a grosser manifestation, say a rotating fan, can explain its more subtle source, electricity, that runs it. Even in science, many fundamental entities or phenomena are inexplicable. Questions like why like poles of a magnet repel each other, why gravitational force or electric force or any other kind of force exists, etc., These cannot be answered. Even if they were to be answered in terms of some other fundamental entities, we could always push our query further to question those entities also. All this only points to the limitation of reasoning ability in our mental constitution. So given that religion cannot explain the goal or its path precisely, then why does it even bother to attempt to do it, and thereby render itself unscientific? Why religion opens itself to fragmentation by putting forward varying explanations of the goal that at best would be a poor, hideous caricature of the lofty goal it preaches? Swami Vivekananda answers, expression is necessarily degeneration, because spirit can only be expressed by the letter, and as St. Paul said, the letter killeth. Life cannot be in the letter, which is only a reflection. Yet, principle must be clothed in matter to be known. We lose sight of the real in the covering and come to consider that as the real, instead of as the symbol. This is an almost universal mistake. Every great teacher knows this and tries to guard against it. But humanity, in general, is prone to worship the seen rather than the unseen. This is why a succession of prophets have come to the world to point again and again to the principle behind the personality and to give it a new covering suited to the times. Truth remains ever unchanged, but it can only be presented in a form. So, from time to time, a new form or expression is given to truth, as the progress of mankind makes them ready to receive it. End of quote. Now, having arrived at this conclusion that divergent, inadequate descriptions of God are necessary, can any fanciful idea be acceptable as religious truth? How one would judge what needs to be followed as a religious doctrine, or if it is a mere superstition? In my opinion, any doctrine following which one becomes more peaceful, contented, unselfish, with love for everyone, is a religious doctrine that needs to be followed. The doctrines put forward by exemplary sages are the right ones, rather than any fanciful idea that just crops in one's own mind. So some discernment is called for. There is this tendency amongst religionists to claim one's own religion or one's own prophet as more true or greater than those of others. Fanaticism in religion can also be rooted out only by appealing to reason. We should recognize that there is truth in other religions or religious sects too. What is the proof, you may ask? The saints that other religions have produced are a valid proof of existence of truth in other religions. And the relative comparison between religions and prophets is therefore meaningless. Again, resorting to Swami Vivekananda, he says, now the question arises if this light of reason is able to judge between inspiration and inspiration, and if this light can uphold its standard when the quarrel is between prophet and prophet, if it has the power of understanding anything whatsoever of religion. If it hasn't, nothing can determine the hopeless fight of books and prophets which has been going on through ages. For it means that all religions are mere lies, hopelessly contradictory, without any constant idea of ethics. The proof of religion depends on the truth of the constitution of man and not on any books. Reason is equally an effect of that common cause, the constitution of man, where our appeal must be. Moving on to the third argument, historicity. A very common point raised against some personages belonging to all religions is that if they truly ever existed. Lord Jesus, Krishna, Rama, and many other personages are sometimes disputed to have ever existed in flesh and blood. Even if their existence was accepted, there is no clarity about when they lived and what events actually happened in their lifetime. Religion could be excused for not keeping a record of the exact time frame of their existence, as probably there was no precise calendars at that point of time, or those that existed may have ceased to exist today. During the times when some of these personages actually lived, there was no tradition of writing either, and hence it is easy to lead to unintentional variations in presenting the personage's biography. Adding to the confusion in their enthusiasm to present this personage as something special and different from ordinary people, the religionists proclaimed that the personage was said to have performed or participated in miraculous events. Over centuries, many such miraculous events got added by people either in exuberance of their devotion or sometimes as propaganda to create faith amongst the people in that personage or his teachings. This led their biographies to be not only varied but also replete with miracles, some or many of which could be untrue. Due to these past inaccuracies, along with the standardization and inviolability of scientific norms in the modern times, religion's defense in proving that these questioned personages were people who really existed at some time in the past has almost become untenable. It therefore has to present one version of the personage's life amongst the hundreds available as the correct one, that is usually replete with miracles. For example, many such personages are said to have been born with no conception, or events such as Sri Krishna lifted a mountain, or Lord Jesus walked on water, etc. As a scientist, it would be difficult to comprehend how such events could have happened, and along with the lack of historical time frame, gives rise to a simple, perhaps naive, conclusion that they never actually existed. Without getting into the debate if the personage actually existed or if the miracles associated with that religious personage actually happened, I would say that the fact that the different biographies of these personages got preserved through times when writing was not prevalent is mainly due to the fact that their lives got associated with miracles. An uninteresting, ordinary life would hardly be remembered by people, and it cannot outlive the passage of time. So whatever be the reason for the miracles to be associated with the personage's life, whether they were truly historic or an innocent interpretation by a devotee in exuberance or as part of a scheming propaganda to spread a faith, these miracles were necessary for preservation of the personage's life and hence the religion itself. But why do religionists look for a miraculous, extraordinary life to follow a person's teachings? Does a person's extraordinary life corroborate what he or she teaches as a religion? Certainly not. Religion is not about miracles. There's an incident in Gautam Buddha's life. When the Buddha was once living at Nalanda in the Pavarika grove, a man by the name of Kevadha went up to him, paid homage, and said, "Lord, Nalanda is a successful city. The people living in Nalanda are prosperous, and they have confidence in the Blessed One. Lord, it would be good if the Blessed One appointed a monk to work a marvel of supernormal power, so that the people of Nalanda might become much more confident in the Blessed One." The Buddha replied, "Kevadha, I do not teach the law to bhikkhus, that's monks, in that way." The Buddha gave the same reply when the question was put to him the second and third time. After the third question, the Buddha replied that there were three kinds of supernormal levels. First one, the marvel of supernormal power to appear as many persons, to pass through walls, to fly through the air, walk on water, etc. All these are physical actions the ordinary people cannot perform. Second, the supernormal power to read other people's minds. And lastly, the supernormal power to be able to guide people according to their mental development for their own good, using suitable methods to fit these people. The first two supernormal powers, if displayed for their own sake in order to impress people, are no different from the performance of magicians. A monk who practices such worldly miracles is a source of shame, humiliation, and disgust. Such actions may impress and win converts and followers, but they do not bring enlightenment to help them put an end to suffering. The third kind of supernormal power, though, which may be called a miracle, helps people to get rid of suffering. This is the only supernormal power that is fit to be practiced. The only miracles that should be performed are these: when you see a man full of passion, craving and greed, and you teach him to free himself from passion, craving, and greed, when you see that a man is a slave to hatred and anger, and you use your powers to help him control his hatred and anger, when you come across a man who is ignorant and who cannot see the true nature of the world, everything in this world is impermanent, and you use your powers to help him overcome his ignorance, these are worthy miracles you can perform. That's the end of this anecdote. On the other hand, science must not dismiss any miraculous, inexplicable event that does not fit into the established physical laws. Swami Vivekananda says, since the dawn of history, various extraordinary phenomena have been recorded as happening amongst human beings. Witnesses are not wanting in modern times to attest to the facts of such events, even in societies living under the full blaze of modern science. Surface scientists, unable to explain the various extraordinary mental phenomena, strive to ignore their very existence. They are, therefore, more culpable than those who think that their prayers are answered by a being or beings above the clouds, or than those who believe that their petitions will make such beings change the course of the universe. The latter have the excuse of ignorance, or at least of a defective system of education, which has taught them dependence on such beings, a dependence which has become a part of their degenerate nature. The former have no such excuse. End of quote. Religion must hold on to the principles as its main focus, and the personality of any prophet or incarnation must be only viewed as illustration of those principles. Amongst the major religions of the world, perhaps it is Vedanta alone that holds the principles as a cornerstone. Swami Vivekananda says, Christianity is built upon the life of Jesus Christ, Mohammedanism upon Muhammad, Buddhism upon Buddha, Jainism upon the Jainas, and so on. It naturally follows that there must be in all these religions a good deal of fight about what they call the historical evidences of these great personalities. If at any time the historical evidences about the existence of these personages in ancient times become weak, the whole building of the religion tumbles down and is broken to pieces. We as he talks about Vedanta, escape this fate because our religion is not based upon persons but on principles. That you obey your religion is not because it came through the authority of a sage, no, not even of an incarnation. Krishna is not the authority of the Vedas, but the Vedas are the authority of Krishna himself. His glory is that he is the greatest preacher of the Vedas that ever existed. End of quote. In the same way, scientists have to hold on to the principles of science rather than consideration of any other material gain. Often, the so-called scientific research is manipulated to achieve certain preconceived agenda that would benefit the scientist in his or her career, or a scientist refuses to accept new scientific discoveries just because it does not fit well into their mental framework. It proves that the weakness of human beings is not confined only to religion, but is pervasive in science also. Famous examples: the acceptance of Newton's word by scientific community without any verification when he claimed that he had discovered calculus before Gottfried Leibniz. Einstein's famous remark on his inability to accept quantum theory, "I, at any rate, am convinced that God does not throw dice." Moving on to the fourth argument, utility. It can be seen at twofold: utility at the level of society at large and also at the individual level. Utility at the level of society. Science provides new theories that lay foundation for providing comfort to people's lives besides alleviating their sufferings due to diseases. The utility of a religion is it provides moral and ethical framework for proper functioning of the society. The famous saying of Karl Marx, "Religion is the opiate of the masses," is often quoted by the so-called rationalists to downplay the importance of religion. In their view, religion is outright evil as it subjects an individual to slavish mentality so that a body of priests could control masses. There is some truth in that view. Some of the religious authorities in the past, and perhaps even now, exploited the masses purely to maintain their own power. However, the moral and ethical codes proposed by religion to govern one's life not only bring a semblance of order within an individual's life but also in society. The underlying principle for these moral and ethical codes is unselfishness. For the vast majority of masses that have undeveloped sense of such lofty ideal of unselfishness, an externally imposed moral ethical code via religion is necessary, otherwise chaos would reign in the society. But I have seen people argue that if a person is morally correct in every act, what is the need for religion for that person? The answer to that is one need to introspect why there is an urge to be morally correct or unselfish. This introspection leads to an inquiry called religion. Swami Vivekananda says, all ethics, all human action, and all human thought hang upon this one idea of unselfishness. Why should we be unselfish? Where is the necessity, the force, the power of my being unselfish? You call yourself a rational man, a utilitarian. But if you do not show me a reason for utility, I say you are irrational. Show me a reason why shall I be unselfish and why be good. Because Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so says so does not weigh with me. My utility is to be selfish if utility means the greatest amount of happiness. What is the answer? The utilitarian can never give it. Where did those that preach unselfishness and taught it to the human race get this idea? We know it is not instinctive. The animals which have instinct do not know it. Neither is it reason. Reason does not know anything about these ideas. Whence then did they come? We find in studying history one fact held in common by all the great teachers of religion the world ever had. They all claim to have got their truths from beyond. The science of yoga teaches that they were right in claiming that all this knowledge came to them from beyond reasoning, but that it came from within themselves. The yogi teaches that the mind itself has a higher state of existence, beyond reason, a superconscious state, and when the mind gets to that higher state, then this knowledge, beyond reasoning, comes to man. End of quote. The second utility at the level of society for religion is the idea of brotherhood and universal love propagated and cherished within religion led to creation of many schools, hospitals, orphanages, charity institutions, benefiting billions of people. These tools are developed by the intellect through science, while it is the compassionate religious heart that employs these tools for a good use. Third, art like poetry, sculpture, music, dance, painting, theatre, etc. received and continue to draw a large source of inspiration from religion and religious iconography. Science has barely been a source of inspiration for these fields, although they do provide the technology required for their growth and evolution. And the fourth point is religion is a powerful force for unifying different cultures and races. But on the flip side, it could also be a source of schism between them, leading to a lot of bloodshed. Science too breaks the artificial boundaries amongst humans, but it hardly infuses any sense of strong brotherhood that a religion can do. Utility at the level of individual. Science provides a stimulus for the intellect to blossom in right direction so that it will not be used for one's and others' destruction. That's the usual case we assume, but it's not entirely true always. I sincerely believe that the youth who indulge in violence, if had been fed with proper intellectual challenges through science and technology, would heartily engage themselves in it rather than devising innovative ways of indulging in violence. The best utility of religion is that it provides succor and solace to people in pain and suffering. I dare say no other field, including science, can do this better than religion. Sri Krishna says in Gita, even a little practice of this yoga makes one fearless. Swami Vivekananda says, what right has a person to ask that truth should be judged by the standard of utility or money? Suppose there is no utility. Will it be less true? Utility is not the test of truth. What do we find in this question of utility? The ideal of happiness, that which brings man more happiness is of greater utility to him. That which brings the larger amount of happiness, man takes and gives up that which brings a less amount of happiness. With animals and in the lowest human beings, who are very much like animals, happiness is all in the body. In men, we find a higher plane of happiness, that of thought. And in the Jnani, that is the wise man, there is the highest plane of happiness in the self, the Atman. So to the philosopher, this knowledge of the self is of the highest utility, because it gives him the highest happiness possible. Sense gratifications or physical things cannot be of the highest utility to him, because he does not find in them the same pleasure that he finds in the knowledge itself. And the last argument given is about role models. Any field needs role models who have contributed significantly to that field and are also par excellence. In fact, such luminaries are the illustrations of success in that field and act as an inspiration for others. There are world-famous luminaries in the field of religion and also in science. Personages like Prophet Muhammad, Ramakrishna, Saint Francis of Assisi, Shankaracharya, Ramana Maharshi, Mansur al-Hallaj, Saint Teresa of Avila, Akka Mahadevi, Mirabai, etc. And thousands of such great saints have adorned the religious landscape. Similarly, notable figures like Albert Einstein, Richard Feynman, Marie Curie, Michael Faraday, James Maxwell, Isaac Newton, Galileo Galilei, etc. are well known for their intellectual acumen. But in the latter group of scientists, we rarely find the qualities that every person cherishes to have: love for all, peace, contentment, happiness, etc. While in the religious luminaries, these are the only qualities that they possess. It is naively thought that the religious luminaries lack intellect. In fact, their intellect is so strong that they had a glimpse of the beyond piercing through the limitations of the material world, in which most of the scientist luminaries get stuck. Who would say persons like a Vivekananda or Shankaracharya are not at least as intelligent as Einstein or Newton? Also, the truths that scientists discover need not necessarily reflect in their life. That is why, even though a scientist knows that all is matter, the combination of matter is what we call life, and destruction of this combination leads to death, he or she is still attached to this temporary combination rather than detaching oneself from it to make himself or herself happy. Sri Krishna says in the Gita, if, however, you think that the soul is perpetually born and always dies, you still have no reason to lament, O mighty armed. Whenever any terrorist activity is committed by a religious zealot, an argument is put forward: religion is bad as it spreads hatred and violence. Or whenever a serious religious practitioner, like a monk, gets involved in immoral act, all monks are hypocrites and followers of religion are dimwits. Although these criticisms are a bit sweeping, I would say that such reactions are understandable and unfair to some extent. It is understandable because of the high moral ground that religion has carved for itself, and any lack of uphold of such lofty ideals will be quite glaring, opening itself for severe rebuke. For example, a small stain on a pure white cloth is more visible than one on an already stained cloth. In fact, we should be happy that there is an outrage against religion itself whenever such acts come to limelight, because it shows that religion still occupies a high moral ground in the mind space of people, and any minor slip from its followers is viewed seriously by public at large. The day when people stop caring about the misdeeds done by religious followers, it can be said to be the death of religion. I also mentioned that the criticism is unfair to some extent because most of the unethical acts or crimes committed by religious followers are due to human greed, and religion was just used as a pretext by them to give vent to their vices. The same so-called rationalists do not ridicule the entire scientific community when a scientist indulges in some malpractice. Also, even for a religious follower to indulge in large-scale violence, the tools are usually provided through research done by scientists. So why absolve the scientist of any blame for violence? And I think that's the conclusion. I want to summarize what was presented here. Veracity, demonstrability, verifiability, and falsifiability are the three epistemological principles for science. The tools need to be appropriate for experimenting in religion. We also saw only the epistemologic principle of verifiability holds in religion. The empirical epistemology in science can be validated by the paradigm held by religion. There should be preparation on the part of the one who is experimenting in either field, and religion must also subject itself to intellectual analysis to remove superstitions. The next one was definiteness. What causes the variety in expression of religious goal that was presented? Why there is a need for this variety in religious practices, and using reasoning, religion must guard itself against fanaticism amongst the plethora of different sects. The third one was historicity. The causes for vagueness in the biography of old religious luminaries was seen. How religion can adopt the scientific attitude in recording its own history. Why it should stop its focus on miracles. The need for science to acknowledge its inadequacy in explaining those miracles. The fourth one was utility. We also questioned why we should look at utility in any field. And if we have to, what we saw were the greater advantages religion had over science at both the individual and society level. And lastly was the role models. The role models of religion have a better life compared to those in science. The scientist's life has a dichotomy between intellectual thought and actual awareness. How religion occupies a superior position in the mind space of people, thereby attracting criticism it does not rightfully deserve always. And what's the way forward? In my opinion, Vedanta, or mysticism of any religion in general, while clearly demarcating the domains between religion and science, advocates the application of a scientific attitude in religion. It prescribes different symbols for the psychological development of the practitioners based on their state of mind. The goal thus could be God as impersonal formless, personal formless, personal with form, and the paths to reach the goal are the four yogas, Bhakti, Raja, Karma, Jnana, that deal with the four faculties of our mind, emotion, thought, the eye sense, and intellect, respectively, as put forward by Swami Vivekananda. Vedanta emphasizes on the experience of the goal, called God or self, or by other names, as the fulfillment of life. It maintains that faith and reasoning are just two tools, and both are necessary for one to experience the goal. Reasoning to keep the mind channeled in the right direction towards the goal without any distractions, while faith in oneself or a higher power called God, that the goal can be reached. Vedanta calls upon every religious practitioner to be a scientific religionist and conduct a religious experiment to verify and realize the religious hypothesis put forward by saints in the scientific religious journals called scriptures. It therefore wants a religionist to be a mystic or more scientific than scientist himself or herself, who, unlike the mystic, could just be satisfied with mere intellectual reasoning with no awareness to commensurate that reasoning. Thank you, friends.